On this Tuesday night, class is in session in the time of COVID-19. The unprecedented back-to-school jitters when physical distancing is not an option.
The number one thing that provinces should be insisting upon is social distancing.
The U.S. president unwelcome in Wisconsin.
We don't have any words for the orange man.
How Trump is describing the police shootings of unarmed black men and recognizing residential schools.
It's important that we learn from our history, both good and bad.
Acknowledging a shameful chapter of Canada's past.
Global National with Donna Friesen. Reporting tonight, Robin Gill.
Good evening and thank you for joining us. With September now upon us, families across this country are in transition mode as kids head back to school. The official first day back is different depending on where you live, but people everywhere are feeling similar anxiety over how school will work in the time of COVID-19. In some regions, it's been a rocky start. In Alberta, where many students went back to class today, one school was forced to remain closed after a staff member tested positive. Public health officials have warned there's no way to reduce the risk to zero, but some parents and teachers say more could be done to limit the spread of the virus. In tonight's top story, Jeff Semple looks at the lingering concerns as class returns.
Students in Calgary return to the classrooms with their required masks and cohorts, becoming the latest to join the national experiment on safe schooling in a pandemic.
It's nice to maybe get a sense of normalcy going forward, but we'll have to see, right?
Meters cannot be maintained. Students will be required to wear masks in all shared and common areas, including hallways and on school buses.
I think from a messaging standpoint, I am confused because obviously physical distancing, spreading people out is one of the biggest tools that we have against COVID-19.
And yet for many teachers across the country, physical distancing feels like a distant dream.
But to have classrooms of 30, 35 students in classrooms that can't physically have desks far enough apart to even maintain a 1 meter distance is concerning, to put it mildly.
Ontario's 4 major teachers' unions are filing formal complaints with the province's Labour Board, citing unsafe working conditions and demanding smaller classes.
But the number one thing that provinces should be insisting upon is social distancing and smaller class sizes as a result, and hiring more teachers.
Wonderful. Up you go. Have a great day of learning.
Excellent. Ontario's premier, who toured a school ahead of students returning next week, insists the unions are playing politics and his plan is based on science.
I'm going to always listen to the docs and science.
Infectious disease experts interviewed by Global News are divided on the issue of smaller classes. Some believe the situation is manageable.
We have very low community burden of disease, so this reduces the risk for everybody in all circumstances. And I think that right now the chance of getting COVID at school is quite low.
In New Brunswick, with only a few cases of COVID-19, the government is disregarding distancing and relying instead on student bubbles.
Within their classroom groupings, students will be able to interact with other students and educators without physical distancing.
Whatever the model, school is now in session, and the debate around distancing is no longer theoretical. Jeff Semple, Global News, Toronto.
Schools around the world are also reopening this week. That includes Europe, despite an upward trend in new infections. In hard-hit Spain, kids as young as 6 must wear masks, but in England, also severely impacted by COVID-19, most students won't be required to wear face coverings. As Redmond Shannon reports, governments are watching nervously to see which back-to-school plans pass and which ones fail.
Students and parents listening intently on a back-to-school day with more nerves than normal. This mother says she has a heart condition and will take her daughter out of school if there are any positive cases, even though attendance is mandatory in France, at least for part of the week.
Bit by bit, this incredible country is getting back on its feet and recovering from this crisis.
In the UK, the government has faced heavy criticism from teachers for waiting until last Friday before issuing its pandemic planning for schools.
We've had to have staggered drop-offs in the morning, collections in the afternoon, different playtimes in different locations.
In a late policy U-turn, England will only require masks in high school corridors in regions with high infection rates. Scotland and Northern Ireland will require masks in all high schools. Wales is leaving the decision with each school. A recent study showed kids in England to be 3 months behind on their learning, with poorer students worst affected. In Spain, where the virus was just as deadly as the UK, much stricter rules are in effect. Everything possible has been done, says school director Mother Marta. Masks are mandatory for all Spanish kids over the age of 5. Everyone has their temperature taken and desks are 1.5 metres apart. This teacher fears cases will still surge after schools reopen. Sweden, however, never closed schools and didn't advise mask wearing for pupils or staff. It does have an overall death rate almost as high as Spain, but a joint government study said infections among children have been no higher than in neighbouring Finland, where schools were closed. Although one Swedish school did see a quarter of its staff infected and one teacher die of COVID-19. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
More than 1 million students are back in class in what was once ground zero of the pandemic. After months of lockdowns and restrictions, Wuhan has now reopened all schools and kindergartens. It's a big step for the city, which suffered the worst COVID-19 outbreak in China. As part of the new rules, students must wear masks to and from school and avoid public transit if possible. India is pressing ahead with its academic plans despite having one of the fastest growing caseloads in the world. Today, more than 2 million students sat for their college admission exams. The government had faced pressure to defer the tests, but refused. Since the start of the pandemic, more than 3.6 million people in India have tested positive. The Privy Council office has now hired a consulting firm to review allegations of workplace harassment inside Rideau Hall. Governor General Julie Payette is accused of creating a toxic and unbearable environment for staff. There are reports she belittled and publicly humiliated employees, reducing some to tears. Both current and former staff members will be interviewed by Quintet Consulting Corporation on a voluntary basis. Payette will also get a meeting with the firm. NDP ethics critic Charlie Angus says he hopes the results and any recommendations will be made public with action taken if needed.
I have met Madame Payette a number of times and I have enormous respect for her, but she represents the Canadian people and has to meet the highest standards, and these allegations are deeply concerning.
Payette's secretary and longtime friend Assunta Di Lorenzo is also accused of abusive treatment. Payette says she takes workplace harassment issues very seriously and welcomes an independent review. The final report is due later this fall. The American president is adding more fuel to the fire in the wake of the police shooting of Jacob Blake that triggered deadly protests. Today, Donald Trump surveyed the damage in Kenosha. He chose not to meet Blake's family and instead used his time to praise police. Trump was never welcome in Wisconsin, but as Jackson Proskow reports, he went anyway.
The mayor and governor had asked him to stay home. President Donald Trump came to Kenosha, Wisconsin anyway.
We're going to work with you. We're going to help you. Okay? We'll help you rebuild.
Touring the damage from nights of protest over the police shooting of Jacob Blake. Meeting with police, but not Blake's family.
And all I ask is that he keep his disrespect, his foul language far away from our family. We need a president that's going to unite our country and take us in a different direction.
Kenosha is still reeling.
Jacob Blake!
It's not just only about Jake being shot. It exposes inequality. So we cannot just be free, we must also be equal.
Trump has poured gasoline on the fire without acknowledging the reason for the demonstrations.
Do you believe systemic racism is a problem in this country?
Well, you just keep getting back to the opposite subject. We should talk about the kind of violence that we've seen.
The president has instead likened police who shoot unarmed black men to a bad game of golf.
But they choke, just like in a golf tournament, they miss a 3-foot putt.
2 months out from Election Day, the president is stoking fears of widespread violence to shore up his base. Critics accuse him of openly fanning the flames.
When has he condemned anything that's occurred on the far right? When has he spoken up about peace and unity? When has he done that?
Trump claims things will only get worse under a Biden presidency. The chaos has arrived under his own.
Women in the suburbs have gotten tired of his posture on so many issues. Can he win them back with the law and order turn, with a pledge to restore law and order? I frankly doubt it.
For Trump, the violent protests are a distraction from the other issues gripping everyday American life. The pandemic, record unemployment, and the most closely watched election in a generation.
And for the first time today, Trump offered condolences to Jacob Blake and his family, saying he feels terrible for anyone who goes through a thing like that after being asked by reporters. He also offered up $1 million in funding for Kenosha's police force. Keep in mind the context here. Wisconsin is a swing state. It helped put Trump over the top in 2016. And Robin, it will be vital to securing his re-election in 2020.
Jackson Proskow in Washington. Thanks, Jackson. To the digital battle in Australia now. Facebook is threatening to block users in that country from sharing local and international news stories. It's in response to a proposed code by Australia's competition watchdog. It wants companies like Facebook and Google to pay a fair price to local news organizations for displaying their content. The Australian government is trying to curb the power of these platforms and to offset advertising revenue losses. A 12-year-old boy gets busted. Coming up, the joyride that sent him straight to police. Plus, creative campaigning, how to vie for votes with the coronavirus around. And North Korea's new mandate, Kim Jong-un's orders to his soldiers at the border. A 12-year-old is in big trouble today after he was caught going on a joyride in Toronto. Early this morning, police responded to calls of an SUV driving erratically on a major highway, nearly hitting other vehicles. Officers eventually caught up and found a boy clearly way too young to be behind the wheel. The boy's father says he was asleep at the time, unaware where his son was, until police showed up at his front door.
This boy has been a good, well-behaved boy. He's obedient, he's mild-mannered, he talks respectfully to everybody.
Has he ever done anything like this before?
No, nothing like this at all.
The father was then brought to the scene to pick up his son. Luckily, there were no injuries or damage to the vehicle. No word on any charges. Governments across Canada are keeping a close eye on New Brunswick, where the first provincial election campaign during the pandemic has crossed the halfway mark. The usual candidate meet and greets are much more challenging because of the risk of COVID-19. And as Ross Lord reports, for one politician who got into the race after tragedy, making a personal connection with voters means taking extra precautions.
In Canada's first pandemic election, candidates in New Brunswick are stepping tentatively. Many from the opposition Liberals, like Stephen Burns, are still going door to door.
I sanitize my hands, go to the door. I will use my pen to hit the doorbell. Then I back up 10 feet. And if someone comes to the door, I just ask them, first of all, whether they're okay with me being here and having a conversation.
By contrast, the governing Progressive Conservatives are staying away. Premier Blaine Higgs hopes high approval ratings from stifling COVID-19 will turn his thin minority government into a strong majority. Higgs' candidates are relying on phone calls and social media instead of face-to-face contact.
I think they really appreciate the fact that we're not going up to their door. We're not even putting brochures in mailboxes. My brochures are going to be arriving in the mail this week. So we're being very cautious. You can't be too careful.
As a first-timer, Burns says traditional campaigning gives him an edge.
I have only had a couple people out of those 1,000 that had any concern, and once I explained to them, how it works, they were more than fine to talk to me.
For him, awkward conversations are nothing new. His wife, Sarah, a Fredericton police officer, was one of 4 people killed by a gunman 2 years ago, leaving him as a single parent to their 3 boys. Burns is campaigning on a call for better mental health services for youth.
Then that obviously stems from the things that I went through with my kids and the death of my wife.
Wilson says the PCs have already made mental health a priority.
Number 1 announcement, so top priority. So we have to agree completely.
As they disagree on how to deliver their messages in this campaign unlike any other. Ross Lord, Global News.
Still ahead, how French satire is striking back as a tragedy is put on trial. Developments tonight in the case of the man who inspired the Hollywood film Hotel Rwanda. Tonight, Paul Rusesabagina's family accuses Rwanda's government of kidnapping the 66-year-old on made-up charges. Rusesabagina, an outspoken critic of Rwanda's government, is now being held in Rwanda's capital. He had traveled to Dubai, where he was arrested on terror charges. Rwanda's president holds close ties with the United Arab Emirates and has been accused of hunting down critics overseas. In 1996, Rusesabagina fled Rwanda and sought political asylum in Belgium. In 2016, he announced a political campaign against Rwanda's government, which he labeled a dictatorship. The French satirical newspaper Charlie Hebdo is republishing controversial cartoons of the Prophet Mohammed as the trial for the deadly terror attack on its Paris office begins. The publication hasn't reprinted the images since the aftermath of the January 2015 attack, which killed several cartoonists. The editors say, "We have always refused to do so, not because it is prohibited, the law allows us to do so, but because there was a need for a good reason to do it, a reason which has meaning and which brings something to the debate." 14 people are accused of being accomplices in the shooting sprees at the Charlie Hebdo offices and at a kosher supermarket 2 days later. A total of 17 people died. All 3 gunmen involved were killed in shootouts with police. The president of the Philippines is publicly ordering the country's top customs official to shoot and kill drug smugglers. It's one of Rodrigo Duterte's most overt threats yet under his anti-drug crackdown. He says he fears narcotics are flowing into the Philippines through its ports, where corruption is deeply rooted. More than 5,700 mostly poor drug suspects have been killed during Duterte's 4-year anti-drug campaign, the focal point of his presidency. And North Korea appears to be taking a heavy-handed approach to cracking down on the spread of COVID-19. Leader Kim Jong-un has reportedly ordered police and soldiers to shoot anyone who gets within 1 kilometer of the Chinese border. The government is sending ammunition to help officials carry out the new policy, which will be in effect until the pandemic ends. North Korea claims to be the only virus-free country in the world. Up next, recognizing Canada's residential schools and their place in history.
You're watching Global National.
The residential school system is a dark chapter in Canadian history. Tens of thousands of Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit children were forced to attend the government-run institutions. Nearly 3,000 children are known to have died while at the schools. It's likely many other deaths were not documented. The abuse many experienced has affected generations of families. Today, the federal government recognized the system as a defining event that's not to be forgotten. And as Abigail Beeman reports, 2 former schools will now be National Historic Sites.
That's where I slept.
When he goes inside the former Portage La Prairie, Manitoba residential school now, Ernie Daniels smells chlorine.
5, 6 years old, I was dragged up the stairs that way and thrown into a bathtub full of chlorine.
He grew up to become chief, then successfully fought to reclaim the building and surrounding land. Daniels calls the National Historic Site designation vindication.
We had a long road, winding road to this day.
Former schools in Portage La Prairie and Shubenacadie, Nova Scotia are now National Historic Sites, and the entire residential school system is being declared historically significant.
As we recall the phrase to kill the Indian within the child.
For Canada to move forward in an inclusive way, and particularly with Indigenous peoples on a path to reconciliation, it's important that we recognize our history, that we learn from our history, both good and bad.
Learn more about what it is that's happened. Learn more about why we use terms like cultural genocide when we're talking about this. Sit with that concept for a bit. Be uncomfortable.
Those working on reconciliation say the announcement is just the beginning, and it's not just about more designations. The government has been criticized for being slow to act on the 94 calls to action the Truth and Reconciliation Commission made in 2015. Commemoration is part of that.
There are many calls to action that have yet to be implemented. We still have to find all of the kids that remain in unmarked burial sites across the country.
In Portage, Lorraine Daniels has been working on opening a national museum inside the old school, slowed by COVID-19 and a lack of funding.
It is going to be a place where there was hurt because of the residential school era and will now be a place of healing.
She says survivors are often asked to forgive, but all Canadians should never forget this part of history. Abigail Beeman, Global News, Ottawa.
And that is Global National for this Tuesday. I'm Robin Gill. We leave you tonight with the start of a poignant return. 2 of Canada's snowbirds finally took off from Kamloops today, over 3 months after they lost one of their own to tragedy. They're making their way home to their base in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. Thank you for watching. Donna Friesen will be back here tomorrow, and I'll see you this weekend. Have a great night.